All right, everybody, I'll get us started. Welcome to the Hennepin-University Partnership webinar series. Today's webinar is titled Policing, Racial Trauma, and Accelerated Aging, New Evidence from Youth Epigenetics, and is presented by Dr. Juan Del Toro. My name is Margaret Stembo-Turvey, and I'm a Senior Project Manager with the Hennepin-University Partnership. The Hennepin-University Partnership is a collaboration between Minnesota's most populous county and its only land-grant university. At HUP, we're dedicated to catalyzing and supporting mutually beneficial relationships. The partnership has led to nearly 500 joint projects, combining academic research and local expertise to inform policy and practice for the benefit of county residents. The goals of this webinar series are to offer information exchange and showcase research. While the webinar is designed primarily with a Hennepin County audience in mind, it is also open to the public and our university partners. We know people are joining today with different levels of familiarity with the topic, and our presenter will aim to address the subject matter from a range of perspectives. We hope the session is both accessible and informative to everyone. Before we get started, just a few Zoom reminders for our audience. Your video, audio, and chat are not enabled, so if you need any support from the HUP team, please use the Q&A function. If you'd like to ask a question, you can also submit that through the Q&A function. We will monitor questions throughout and save time to address them at the end. This webinar is being recorded, so please look for an email from hup@umn.edu with a survey and a link to the recorded webinar video tomorrow. And finally, we're so glad to welcome and introduce the presenter. Dr. Juan Del Toro is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts. His research focuses on how interpersonal and structural discrimination, particularly through policing, affects child and adolescent development. His interdisciplinary work bridges developmental psychology, sociology, and public health to understand how stress impacts physical and mental health over time. His research is supported by the National Institutes of Health. And now I'll turn it over to Juan for the presentation.
Thank you, Margaret, for that introduction. And thank you all for coming to the talk. Looking forward to the Q&A that's going to come after this, and as well as any potential collaborations that come out of this work as well. So I'll go ahead and get started. The title of my presentation is Policing Racial Trauma, Accelerated Aging, and New Evidence Coming Out of Studying Youth Epigenetics. And so as I explore my work, I integrate social survey, biological, and genetic or epigenetic data to answer really interesting research questions that are relevant to me. And one of the nice things about studying epigenetic aging is that we can study and understand what happens when our cells age either faster or slower than we do. And so first, let's define epigenetics. It's broadly defined as how experiences and environment could turn either on or off certain genes without changing the DNA structure. And oftentimes the on and off, turning on and off certain genes is considered methylation. And so epigenetic aging can accelerate, which indicates that our cells look older than our chronological age. And epigenetic aging acceleration has been linked to stress, discrimination, pollution, and chronic adversity. Despite this, though, there's also the opportunity for epigenetic aging to decelerate, which indicates that our cells look younger than our chronological age. And epigenetic aging deceleration has been associated with supportive relationships, exercise, good sleep, and healthy nutrition. So there is opportunity that although we may be accelerating epigenetically at certain points in time, there's also the opportunity to decelerate our epigenetic aging clock. And so this becomes a really opportunity to address stress, promote equity, and improve context to slow epigenetic aging and promote resilience. And I became really interested in this work just because of how there's a distinction between how phenotypically we look like we're aging as people of color, but also kind of what's going on underneath the skin. And so I'm sure we've all heard quotes like brown don't frown, Asian don't raisin or black don't crack. But really, oftentimes, what's going on in the outside may not reflect what's going on in the inside. And so here's just one empirical example. I'll present where these data came from later on in this presentation. But if we were to take a sample of youth of color, specifically African American youth and white youth, and we were to give them self-reported surveys on depressive symptoms, so how often they're experiencing feeling down or blue. So the y-axis is kind of how often kids are feeling depressive symptoms, and then the x-axis is how youth are reporting mean levels on depressive symptoms by race. And so if we look at these self-report measures and what kids are reporting, they don't tend to differ significantly on depressive symptoms. There's almost no differences. But if we were to turn to epigenetic age acceleration, for example, so on the y-axis is epigenetic age acceleration, and the x-axis is again racial group differences. Where if we revisit the y-axis, you see the values can range from negative values to positive values. So any value above zero means more accelerated epigenetic aging, whereas negative values indicate much more decelerated epigenetic aging. Here we
Hey,
see
Del
much more
Toro.
stark. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just jump in for 1 second? We have just a couple people in the chat who are having issues with your audio. It is coming through for me, but I wonder if you maybe disconnect and reconnect if it could fix the audio. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
How does this sound?
Oh, that sounds good to me.
Okay. I guess does anybody in the chat kind of want to say how it sounds to them?
Yeah, thanks. Let's see. Way better from the chat. Okay.
Okay, good.
I'm glad we got that resolved. Thank you.
Would it be helpful if I start over? Just curious. I'm happy to, but yeah, yeah.
I'll keep an eye on the chat for a minute and see what folks think. No need to start over, but much better now.
Okay.
Well, okay. Sounds like you can keep going. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, and thank you, audience, for letting me know too. So, I want to make sure people hear me. So, but I was presenting on the slide, how sometimes if we rely just on self-reports, we may not notice racial group differences. People are on average reporting very similar levels on, let's say, depressive symptoms. But if we were to turn to looking at what's going on underneath the skin, then we notice that there's these stark racial group differences. So as you notice, Black youth are on average showing much more accelerated epigenetic aging, whereas white youth on average are showing much more decelerated epigenetic aging. So, looking at what's going on underneath the skin could really help us understand and address health equities much more potentially reliably than if we rely on psychosocial measures. And so, really, my work is premised on two core research questions. One, how does racial ethnic discrimination from various perpetrators, including adolescents, peer networks, their teachers, law enforcement, contribute to their development? And the idea behind specifying these perpetrators is that it enables us to really understand where and which context may be much more optimal in trying to improve certain developmental outcomes. But where I'm actually going to spend most of this presentation on actually is on my second research question that kind of drives my work, which is how do adolescents develop resilience against racial ethnic discrimination? So most of this session is going to be more focused on trying to think about what are things that we could do about it to instill youth with resilience and slow down even epigenetic aging. And so throughout my presentation, I'm going to first start off with why it matters to study racial ethnic discrimination during adolescence. I'll then segue into my two lines of work with an exemplary study to show really specifically how certain things operate. So, for example, in one line of work, I try to understand how parents can instill youth with resilience against discrimination. And then I'll segue into my second line of work in which I try to understand what are things that schools can do to offer youth with resilience against discrimination. And then I'll conclude with certain future directions that I'm taking my work with. And so I'll get started with kind of a brief understanding of why it matters to study discrimination during adolescence. And so throughout my work, I study interpersonal experiences of discrimination, and discrimination, especially that which is targeting groups based on race ethnicity, pertains to the prejudicial and unfair treatment that youth may perceive or may even experience without their knowledge, that limits their opportunities, resources, and power. And that's also kind of, we notice that leads to differences between their access to opportunities, resources, and power relative to white youth. And, although I do study these things that are going on interpersonally, that is not to say that certain things aren't going on structurally, as there's definitely more structural forces like racism, that really shape certain experiences that are going on interpersonally and that are contributing to heightened levels of racial ethnic discrimination and much more at an interpersonal level. And when adolescents start transitioning between childhood to their teenage years, they begin developing certain cognitive skills that enable them to develop much more awareness about stereotypes about their own racial ethnic group. And they begin to notice that stereotypes about their own racial ethnic group are very different from how stereotypes look like and about other racial ethnic groups. So they become much more aware about their opportunities for success may differ from those of other racial ethnic groups. And so while that is unfolding cognitively, there's certain experiential factors that are unfolding as adolescents are transitioning from childhood to the teenage years. One specifically being a sense of autonomy and independence outside the household, as adolescents begin venturing out into the world with less parental supervision. So they're much more likely to interact with unfamiliar strangers without a parent's presence. And that could really create contexts where unfamiliar strangers may treat youth in accordance with negative racial ethnic stereotypes. And while these cognitive and experiential factors are unfolding, adolescents are also biologically vulnerable as the HPA axis, which regulates the stress hormone cortisol, is sensitive to stressfully novel experiences, which perceived discrimination is during this period, and is sensitive to threats to ego and control, which can be especially undermined when discrimination happens. And also, if we think about in terms of what's going on in the brain, adolescent's limbic system, which is in charge of their self-control and executive function, is really still developing throughout the adolescent years. So adolescents don't have the same capabilities to cope with stressors and discrimination like adults can. And so, indeed, there are a swath of studies that have found that racial ethnic discrimination is harmful. It's associated with academic outcomes, psychological, physiological outcomes, regardless of whether they are objectively or subjectively reported. And studies find that there are weak to non-significant associations between discrimination and adjustment outcomes among white youth, providing an indication that there's something about the nature of discrimination that youth of color are perceiving and experiencing that really leads to these consequential outcomes that we don't see when white youth are reporting on discrimination. And so, what I've been trying to build off this work is really trying to understand what we could do about it. And, one thing, one source and context where adolescents develop resilience is in the home, and especially from their parents. And so I wrote an article for a chapter that's going to be coming out next year. There's a preprint online that's freely available. And in this article, I looked at to what degree fathers' racial ethnic identities protect youth against the negative effects of epigenetic age acceleration on police intrusion, or the negative effects of police intrusion on the epigenetic age acceleration. Got that switched. And so we could think about what is it that's about police intrusion that is driving kids to experience accelerated epigenetic aging. And so police intrusion, we can think of it as a source of stress because of how police surveillance, the way it operates, is really trying to surveil communities where police officers suspect crime is likely to happen. And so, of course, when they're suspicious of certain crimes, they're much more likely to target low-income communities which constitute predominantly communities of color. And so when they're going into these communities and heavily surveilling them, they're also engaging in practices that are much more intrusive relative to the type of policing that they're engaging in when they're surveilling certain high-income, predominantly white communities. And so some of the experiences of policing that's targeting communities of color, such as stop and frisk, those experiences, when they're chronic, could really lead to epigenetic age acceleration because of a weathering process. And so the way that weathering works is that if you were trying to think about kind of like there's a wooden table in your living room and you have it's a rainy day or a rainy night and there's a leak on the roof. And so, if there's the first leak on the table that leaks onto the table and it's a wooden table, the first leak won't do much to the table. But really, if the leak is consistent on the same spot, then we start seeing that there's kind of a weathering that the wooden table starts developing. And so we could think about discrimination having a similar weathering effect on kids aging because of how it's just constantly targeting them and impacting them that really starts eating up at kids' physiological stress processes. And there's many ways that we can think about how fathers' racial ethnic identities can instill kids with resilience against police intrusion. And identity, the thing about it that could be protective is identity is a sense of self that is consistent across time and space. And so this consistency in self could really matter a lot for kids of color who are experiencing discrimination. Because when kids of color experience discrimination, they're much more surveillant, they're much more vigilant, they're much more kind of expecting unfair treatment. And because they've been exposed to inconsistency and uncertainty from discrimination, then really for them, when they start witnessing a parent really engaging in much more consistent practices, that consistency could really matter more to them because of how they're just so used to unfairness and uncertainty from discrimination experiences. So that sense of self that is consistent could really matter a lot for discriminated youth of color. And so for this study, I asked, do adolescents who experience more police intrusion show more advanced epigenetic aging? And did fathers' racial ethnic identity weaken the effect of police intrusion on their epigenetic age acceleration? And here I distinguish between two types of racial ethnic identity components. One including exploration, so how often fathers are learning more about the racial ethnic group versus commitment, the degree to which fathers feel a sense of belonging and commitment to their racial ethnic identity. And so the reason I make the distinction here is because it could be that sense of belonging and commitment and sense of pride in one's racial ethnic group that could really offer kids with resilience and protection against police intrusion. And so for this study, I drew a sample, a national sample of youth of color who were primarily born into single-parent households across 20 cities in the United States. And the study is called the Future of Families and Child Wellbeing Study. The sample was pretty diverse. It included Black youth, Latino youth, as well as youth of color. And most of the other youth of color were primarily multiracial youth. The sample was fairly split by children's sex. And if we turn to education status that mothers acquired, on average, mothers had less than a college degree, which provides an indication of the socioeconomic status of the sample. And so if we were to look at how I measured my outcome, one being epigenetic age acceleration, I estimated kind of this like latent variable that aggregated these distinct epigenetic clocks that are really well established in the literature that have been found to be associated and sensitive to environments, but also really influential on biological stress related processes. And also, kids were self-reported on their most memorable police encounter. And the police encounter items included, whether their most memorable experience included stop and frisks. And this Apple item included use of racial slurs by the police officer. And although it was measured at age 15, a lot of these experiences happened as early as age 8. So again, although it was measured at age 15, a lot of these memorable experiences happened earlier on than the measure was administered. And at kids' birth, fathers completed self-reported items on their degree of engagement in racial ethnic identity exploration and commitment. So one sample item of identity exploration includes I participated in cultural practices of my racial ethnic group. And one sample item of commitment includes I feel a sense of attachment toward my racial ethnic group. And so let's turn to some descriptive findings. How prevalent was police intrusion? Because again, kids were reporting on whether certain experiences happened. And so on the y-axis, it suggests prevalence rates. The x-axis includes how many instances have occurred among youth. And so, although 85% of the sample experienced police intrusion 0 times, really a good proportion of them, 50%, experienced police intrusion to a certain degree. On average, of course, it was close to the scale minimum, so it being 0. But a lot of these estimates could be conservative because it did not measure the frequency of certain things happening. So, although, yes, police intrusion may have happened once, but really, the measure is conservative because it doesn't capture the frequency that certain experiences happen. So this is potentially a much more conservative measure than what we would find using other measures tapping into frequencies of police intrusion. And so let's turn to the results. And so what I found in predicting epigenetic age acceleration is that adolescents who experience police intrusion as early as age 8 also experience epigenetic age acceleration at age 9 much more rapidly. And this is also adjusting for age 9 epigenetic age acceleration. So ruling out potential pre-existing differences that may have been explained by prior epigenetic age acceleration. So father's racial ethnic identity exploration did not moderate the effect of police intrusion. And by moderate, it did not buffer or weaken the effect of police intrusion on epigenetic age acceleration. But now if we turn to looking at the moderating role of racial ethnic identity commitment, again, consistent with the last model, adolescents who experienced police intrusion as early as age 8 also experienced much more rapid epigenetic age acceleration at age 15, controlling for age 9 epigenetic age acceleration. But father's racial ethnic identity commitment did moderate the effect of police intrusion on epigenetic age acceleration. And so really to really understand this moderation effect, we really have to visualize it via simple slope analysis. So here we turn to a simple slope analysis in which the y-axis represents epigenetic age acceleration, the x-axis reflects police intrusion. And so here, as you can see, when fathers are reporting low levels of racial ethnic identity commitment, there's a really strong positive effect of police intrusion on epigenetic age acceleration. But as you can see, as fathers are reporting moderate levels of racial ethnic identity commitment and even high levels of racial ethnic identity commitment, the effect of police intrusion on epigenetic age acceleration is becoming weaker to non-significant, suggesting that father's racial ethnic identity commitment is offering a buffering effect. And so let's turn to understand how robust were some of these findings if we were to consider certain factors. One is, I don't know if people recall, but I did present in one of the initial slides that most of the sample did come from unwedded mothers. That I also tested, well, what about fathers who were present and still around in adolescents' lives? Did residents with the youth moderate the results? And so indeed it did. So with the protective effect of racial ethnic identity commitment was existent among fathers who still lived with the children as opposed to those who did not live with the children at age 15. And I also tested to what degree the findings may be moderated by youth's gender, as we may imagine that maybe because of bo young boys who share the same gender as their fathers, maybe that gender congruence could facilitate that sense of protection much more for boys than for girls. But what I ended up finding is that the protection that fathers offered was consistent across both girls and boys. And and a lot of social science research is really important to test causal inference. And so what I ended up doing is testing to what degree maybe age 9 epigenetic acceleration. Maybe some of these differences happened earlier on, and then that's what predicts differences in police intrusion. But I did not actually find that to be the case here. So really providing much more additional evidence about the causal direction and certain effects between my constructs of interest. And so let's make sense of some of these findings. So I did find that police intrusion predicted more accelerated epigenetic aging, justifying and supporting the idea of the weathering hypothesis, that police intrusion is sort of like has this weathering effect on youth's epigenetic age acceleration. Fathers offered protection when they reported high levels of racial ethnic identity commitment. So that sense of consistency in self, and also the nature of it, in the sense of feeling good about one's racial ethnic group, feeling like they belong with the racial ethnic group. That nature of identity could really offer youth with protection because it could also expand youth networks when they see that their fathers are hanging out with other same racial ethnic group members. And so there were some limitations to the study that, I was able to kind of look at and address in other studies. So one being one of the limitations that I did not examine certain interactions that parents had with with their children that may have instilled them with resilience. Um, and then also, the sample was predominantly focused on low-income families, but in other studies, I was able to find evidence that certain practices, especially those that are culturally relevant, that parents engage in, could still instill kids with resilience, with discrimination. And I was also able to replicate some of these findings using a much more middle class to high income sample. Although these are limitations of the present study, I was able to supplement this in other work that I'd be happy to share. And there were some other strengths to this study, including it was longitudinal. I used this multi-informant approach to amplify adolescents' resilience with implications for future work. And so, why are these findings important for both theory and practice? For one, most studies still rely on psychosocial measures when understanding adolescents' resilience, but really kind of like going into the more biomarker space can really offer us a broader understanding of how families of color may develop resilience. And for interventions, a lot of these culturally grounded practices that families are engaging in could offer kids with resilience. That it begs the question that what if a lot of these culturally relevant practices are in other settings like schools? Could that also offer kids with protection? And that actually kind of is a nice segue to my next line of work, in which I'm actually trying to build a case for more culturally responsive education in K through 12 schools given today's climate in which there's much more conversations about and against critical race theory in K through 12 schools, that I'm trying to build a case that we actually need to have more of these conversations in schools rather than less. And so educators are well aware about the diversity, racial ethnic diversity in their classrooms. Today, we're in a unique time period in United States history where the majority of K through 12 demographics are kids of color. And so, given this landscape and also the idea and the fact that most teachers in K through 12 workforce are predominantly white, um, that suggests that most of the interactions between students and teachers are intergroup, different racial ethnic groups, or it's comprised of two members who are of different racial ethnic groups, the relationship between a student and a teacher on average. And so, really, when teachers engage in these practices, it could potentially indicate a teacher's interest in wanting to get to know more students. So when teachers engage in more culturally responsive education, although they may not share the same upbringing and background as their students, really some of the effects of culturally responsive education could be facilitated by teachers wanting to get to know their students more, getting students to want to share their history and their background with their classmates. In a classroom, because ultimately that's kind of how kids learn about other racial ethnic groups is by having direct interactions with them. And so I've been trying to build up a literature base to really, again, amplify why we need culturally responsive education in K through 12 education. And so I'm going to use this example article in which I looked at the degree to which school cultural socialization, which is another way to phrase culturally responsive education in schools, to what degree some of these practices in schools weaken the effect of racial ethnic discrimination experiences on adolescents' negative affect or negative mood, I should say. And so for this study, I asked, did kids who experience more racial ethnic discrimination predict more negative affect or negative emotions? And did schools' engagement in cultural socialization moderate the relation between racial ethnic discrimination and their negative emotions? And so for this manuscript, I used a two-study project in which one sample included a sample of African American youth who completed a 14-day daily diary. In study two, it constituted Asian American and Latinx adolescents who participated in two bursts or waves of a 15-day daily diary. So in this sample, adolescents were able to complete up to 30 days of daily diaries. And the thing about daily diary is it's not necessarily a diary. It's actually kind of a brief, quick survey that kids complete for 5 minutes each day over a certain period of time. And that's really nice because it provides kind of a quick, intensive longitudinal design. And so in study one, adolescents completed self-reports on how often each day they felt sad or blue. They also self-reported on their racial ethnic discrimination experiences, one being predominantly in online context. So one sample item includes, today, did anyone say or post mean or rude things about you because of your racial ethnic group online? And then sample items of school cultural socialization includes, today in school, did you recognize or celebrate holidays, traditions, and cultures of your racial ethnic group? And in study two, they completed very identical measures, except in study two, because that time period when adolescents completed study two happened following the pandemic, especially when kids were going back in schools, we broadened the measure to include experiences that may be either occurring online or in person. And so let's turn to some descriptive statistics. So among the sample of 134 African American youth, approximately half experienced racial ethnic discrimination at least once during the 14-day daily diary. During the 14-day daily diary, 247 incidences, racist incidents occurred, and approximately a little over half the sample received cultural socialization from school at least once. Then, if we turn to study two, um, among 159 Asian American and Latino youth, 42%, almost the same rate, experienced racial discrimination at least once over the course of a 30-day daily diary. And then there were 528 racist incidences that occurred. And so as you can see, that's definitely double the amount of study one. But recall also study two was the 30-day daily diary versus study one was a 14-day daily diary. So the fact that we just measured kids for a longer period of time, we kind of expected that there would be more racist incidences. And we did notice that there was an uptick in cultural socialization in study two relative to study one. So study one happened a little bit before the pandemic onset versus study two happened after the pandemic. And so the pandemic was also confounded by Black Lives Matter protest movements that happened following a lot of racial discrimination that targeted predominantly African American communities. And so it could have been following the pandemic that teachers became much more knowledgeable and aware of racist incidences that they become much more likely to engage in these conversations following the pandemic rather than before. And so let's turn to some interesting findings that came out of the study. So in study one, what I ended up finding is that I ran very similar models across studies, by the way. But in study one, I found that adolescents, on average, when they experienced racial ethnic discrimination on any given day, they also reported more negative emotions that same day. Although I found that to be an effect on study one, I did not find that to be true in study two, which I'll discuss momentarily. But then if I turn to what degree and tested to what degree school cultural socialization moderated the effect of discrimination on kids' negative emotions, I found that school cultural socialization significantly moderated that effect in study one, and it continued to do so in study two as well. And again, kind of like in my last study, it's really important to do simple slope analyses to really understand the pattern of findings. So in study one, I have my simple slope analysis. And so I guess before I present the findings, I'll just walk you through the y-axis refers to levels of daily negative affect. The x-axis is levels of racial ethnic discrimination. So low levels being kids who on average report below 1 standard deviation below the mean, high levels of racial ethnic discrimination reflecting adolescents who report above 1 standard deviation above the mean on racial ethnic discrimination. And so here, as we notice, when schools are engaging in less cultural socialization, that association between discrimination and negative affect becomes much more positive and significant. But as you can see, the effect is becoming much more weaker to not significant as schools are engaging in more school cultural socialization, illustrating that they're offering a protection and buffering effect. And when we turn to study two, again, the y-axis is negative affect, the x-axis includes levels of racial ethnic discrimination. So as you can see, among the three lines, on average, they're very weak, which is in line with my last table in which I showed that there was a non-significant association between discrimination and negative affect. But as you can see, as schools are engaging in fewer cultural socialization practices, that association between discrimination and negative affect becomes much more positive and steeper. So as adolescents are reporting more discrimination, they're also reporting more negative affect. But that's becoming weaker as schools are engaging in more school cultural socialization, illustrating again another buffering effect and protection. And so let's make sense of these findings. For one, I found that discrimination predicted more negative affect in study one, but not in study two. And so this could be attributable to two things. One being that in study one, most of those participants came from a low-income urban community in Pittsburgh, whereas participants in study two um, came from a survey company that helped us recruit participants. And the thing about online survey companies is that they tend to reflect um, a much more higher income and higher socioeconomic status background. And so it could have been that study two participants came from backgrounds that enabled them to be much more resilient against discrimination than did participants in study one. And again, if you could also recall, there was an uptick in school cultural socialization in study two than in study one. So it could have been just the fact that there was more frequent cultural socialization in school in study two that could have offered those youth with more resilience and protection. And one thing I found across both studies is that school cultural socialization really consistently protected youth against discrimination across both studies. And one thing I didn't report here explicitly, but I've reported in the manuscript, is that parents' cultural socialization didn't consistently offer kids with resilience against discrimination as often as did school cultural socialization. And so this could be attributable to the fact that during the teenage years, adolescents are really kind of relying on their peer networks and educators for a sense of autonomy and independence and support to achieve those goals because there's a lot of societal pressures for adolescents to feel independent outside the family that because of those societal pressures, adolescents are kind of relying more on teachers for that support as well as their peers. So because adolescents are paying attention more to their peers and teachers, that it's potentially because of that cultural socialization in these contexts are offering them with more protection. And so there were some limitations and strengths to the study. So limitation being that, I refer to a lot of these racial ethnic groups with pan-ethnic labels. So there's really a lot of opportunities for future work to really pay attention more to within group heterogeneity and looking at the diverse heterogeneous groups within racial ethnic groups. I looked at one type of racial ethnic socialization, which included cultural socialization. So there are other messages that scholars can test, including kind of messages that really pay attention more to um, sort of the history of prejudice and racism throughout U.S. history and its role in shaping today's society. So really, does those messages that emphasize and talk about barriers and prepare you to address those barriers, do those messages and could those messages offer them protection? It's definitely a direction for future work. But there were some strengths to the study, including that the fact I was able to use this sophisticated, intensive longitudinal design to really understand youth resilience in their day-to-day worlds. And so, why are these findings important for both theory and practice? For one, aggregating or unspecifying perpetrators can mask significant findings. And so, when scholars predominantly study culturally responsive education practices, especially that in family contexts, it could really mask what happens when these practices are occurring in school contexts. And so, really, kind of studying these things that are happening in school context could really allow us to understand how kids develop resilience outside the family that maybe we're not capturing if we just focus on family context. Second, school peers and adults can be optimal settings for intervention because of how, again, during the adolescent years and teenage years, youth really want to be autonomous and independent outside the family. That it could be that they're much more optimal settings for interventions to instill kids with resilience. And really, I want to tie this back to policy because what we could do at the school level really could not matter as much given certain potential legal scrutiny that can happen if there's a state level policy that's curtailing culturally responsive education. And so, really, we need this literature and empirical studies to justify why we need more of these conversations rather than less, rather than fewer of them. And so there's really exciting opportunities I'm taking my work. So as I'm building up both lines of work, I'm really looking forward to where I'm also going in the future, in the near future. Really, the one that I'm really trying to hone in on is really trying to illustrate how discrimination hurts everyone. Because right now we primarily study what happens when discrimination that one experiences could harm them. And we also try to understand how youth of color who witness another person of color experience discrimination, how that could also harm them as youth of color. But we don't think about oftentimes how majority group members could really also be disadvantaged against these policies and interpersonal experiences that are affecting youth of color. And so, really, sometimes I kind of branch out to really understand, for example, what happens when, if you think about a family, there may not be as much variation by racial ethnic group within a family, but there is very potential variation by gender. There's definitely variation by sexual orientation. That I began studying that what happens within a family when one sibling becomes aware of discrimination targeting another sibling, either due to gender or sexual orientation. Do they also feel kind of that spillover effect from discrimination? And I've also been able to find that this actually happens in classroom as well when white youth witness discrimination that a peer student of color may be experiencing from a teacher. Because of how youth want to fit in with their friends, that could potentially be just that relational context that could facilitate that spillover effect from discrimination toward a minority group member that could also disadvantage a member from a majority group. To really try to get buy-in that discrimination is a bigger public health issue and that's hurting a bigger population than we suspected before. So I'm really looking forward to the questions and as well as any potential conversations that happen after this presentation. But I really kind of want to remind folks of kind of the three takeaways of my work. One is to really understand racial ethnic disparities. We need to understand the specific context in which a lot of these ethnic racial related processes occur. Second, relying on a single metric of well-being may not capture the whole picture of adolescent resilience. And so really we could not only study psychosocial measures, but also measures that really get at experiences and processes that are happening underneath the skin. And taking this integrative approach could really provide us with a robust apparatus to understand the nature and consequences of racism and learn better how to address it. And so I'm really thankful for all the collaborators and mentors I've had as I pursue this work, as well as the funding that I've received to also conduct this research over time. So I'm really thankful for everyone. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Del Toro. That was a great presentation, very engaging. We already have a number of questions coming in, so I'm going to go in order. If there are any that I can kind of combine together, I will do so. And for our attendees, please feel free to continue to put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. The first question came in way back at the beginning, but it may have been relevant throughout. When you were sharing the slide with the differences uh, I think it was in depressive symptoms and also in age, reported age reflection. There was a question about how old the youth were in the poll, but I'm actually curious. I'll expand the audience members' question to ask how old the youth were in most of your work, if there was a target age range, or if it was kind of all under age 18. Yes, this is the exact graph that they were responding to.
Yeah, so at this age, it was kids were on average age 15, and with the epigenetic age acceleration, both Black and white youth had the same chronological age. So although they did not differ on chronological age, they did differ on age that's going on underneath the skin. Yeah, yeah. Um, and so in study one, that was a longitudinal sample that followed kids from ages 9 to ages 15. And in study two, the age range was pretty much more broader. So I guess the two studies in study two, I should say, in both of those studies, the age range was between ages 12 to 18. Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And then we have two questions or comments related to ICE. So a comment saying, I'm thinking about how all the ICE roundups are affecting children that get caught in the ICE dragnets. I fear for them now and for their future. And then another attendee asked if for your work, police also included ICE or if that's a separate body of research.
ICE being immigration, right?
Yes.
I heard right. So I'm actually working on an article right now, to really understand the effects of those anti-immigrant experiences and sentiment. Because nowadays, and given the 2025 Supreme Court decision, where ICE agents are able to make stops legally based on their perceived race, ethnicity, of and language of an individual. And so what I find in that work is that a lot of these anti-immigrant rhetoric, policies, and cultural attitudes are associated with negative outcomes among both immigrant and native origin Americans. And so there's universal negative ramifications of a lot of what's going on that's perpetrated from ICE. And so, given a lot of the recency that a lot of these activities are going on, I find that research to be really important in this day and age, just to really address that rhetoric. So that's definitely in the works right now that I'm looking forward to putting out. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Um, and as you were speaking, I believe this question came in when you were speaking about the potential moderating effects of paternal ethno-racial identity. There was a question about youth of color who were adopted living with two parents. Do they age faster? And I'm curious if there's any work in that space.
There's definitely work in that space. And it's quite mixed right now, at least from what I've seen. Um, but I do envision though, given thinking about my work and the role of teachers and for adolescents, that really for parents who may have a different race from their kids, really it's about that sense of relationship and connection with the youth. So I guess I'm kind of drawing on the fact that most of the teachers differ from the race of the students. That if I think about that dynamic and think about it in the family dynamic, that I could definitely see multiracial parents really being capable of instilling kids with resilience against discrimination and slowing down that epigenetic aging. So there's definitely room for opportunities there.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Another person is curious about interventions, in this case, as you were speaking, involvement or presence by fathers as buffers in early childhood time. Specifically, the question is about ages 0 to 4.
Yeah. Interventions. I would have to give that more thought just because most of my work is on the adolescent years as opposed to like the early years. I'll definitely give them some thought. So if you reach out to me to my email, I'll do some digging and we'll be happy to get back to you.
Um, and another question, could you speak to the increasingly racially segregated school landscape? The question asker mentions there are many culturally based charter schools here in the Twin Cities metro, as an example.
Yeah. Um, I'd be curious to learn more about that. At least because that's where I'm actually going in my future work. Is a potential kind of like modeling role of school racial composition. Especially not just for minority students, but also for white students, because also we need white youth to have these conversations and not always. And given how schools are segregated. There's the idea that white students shouldn't have these conversations if they're attending predominantly white schools, um, which is a bad idea. They should definitely be engaging in these conversations because ultimately, at some point in time, they're going to be interacting and have to learn how to interact with students from different backgrounds and individuals from different backgrounds. So there's definitely that rhetoric that's out there that's not justified, and so really that's kind of where I want to take my work and build on it more is really kind of understand the role of racial composition. Does it facilitate some of these practices? Does it enhance them? So it's definitely work that I'm looking forward to testing out. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Um, I see one more question and a comment. The question is, what could police do to contribute to youth resilience?
The, there's a lot two that come to mind. So there's work that's been done to really understand what happens when there's a more diverse police workforce. And what they find is that yes, diversity matters. There's less intrusive stops. There's more trust from the community toward police officers. And also, the nature of interaction between law enforcement and the community really matters because oftentimes, if we think about and look at a predominantly white neighborhood, there's more kind of community initiated police interactions where it's more so the communities are reaching out to law enforcement, whereas it's reverse if we look at low income, predominantly communities of color, where there's more police initiated surveillance. And so we kind of need to think about the idea that we know what's working. What if we just try these practices more equitably and have more community initiated contact with the police as opposed to police initiated contact? So there's kind of both of those ideas where there's kind of the value of diversity, but also in trying to think about what are practices that are efficient and we could adopt more equitably across communities.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I see one more comment in the chat, which was a response as you were talking about the harm on others, and just to repeat, discrimination has so many layers of harm in the community. Um, so I don't see any other questions. I'll give it another second as we wrap up. Audience members, please feel free to add. Um, Dr. Del Toro, I wonder if you could go back to the screen with your contact information. Since we have so much interest, I know some folks may be interested in reaching out if they have more questions after today, but we've been really thankful for your presentation. Um, I'm going to read this comment that just came in. If I leave here thinking believable lovability is a factor for resilience, would you say that's a fair conclusion? So it's also a question for you, Dr. Del Toro. As in seeing a father who it is assumed you love and value, validate radicalized experiences is a believable source for lovability after experiencing the opposite from a radicalized experience. Sorry, thank you for correcting me. Racialized, not radicalized. And in schools, seeing yourself as lovable or valued.
Can you repeat that one more time? Sorry.
Yes, it's also in the chat if it's easier to read here.
Okay.
But the person's asking, is it a fair conclusion to leave this webinar thinking that believable lovability is a factor for resilience? And as an example of believable lovability, seeing a father who you love and value validate racialized experiences with strong positive racial identity.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Awesome. Um, all right. Well, I'm sure people probably still have a couple of questions. Hopefully, if they come up later or as you're thinking later, you have this contact information. I just want to say a huge thank you to you, Dr. Del Toro, for sharing your time and research with us, and thank you to all of our audience members for joining us. We do have a feedback form I'm going to put in the chat right now. If you have a minute to fill that out, Help would love to know more about your experience. And yeah, I'm seeing a thank you in the chat as well, or a thank you in the Q&A. Thank you so much, Dr. Del Toro. For all of our audience members, the recording will come out tomorrow, and we really appreciate your engagement and your thoughtful questions. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Margaret.
All right.
And I look forward to staying in touch, everybody.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.